and who was doing it the way he wanted to do it.
At 92, Willie Nelson isn't writing an autobiography. He's writing a list. Not a list of immortal songs, nor the people he once loved to sing with, but 10 names, 10 singers that made him retreat, stay silent, or outright turn his back. There were people he once admired, then disappointed, and there were names that just mentioning them made him shake his head without saying another word. Willie Nelson was quiet, but when he refused to share the stage with anyone, the whole music industry heard it loud and clear. Let's explore the list of 10 names below. 1. Toby Keith. The patriot who spoke loudly and was forever erased by Nelson. Topping the list of names Willie Nelson avoided the most was Toby Keith. Nelson believed that Toby Keith used music to promote war, spread hatred, and used patriotism as a tool to intimidate others. For a man who fought for peace and humanity like Willie Nelson, that was a line that could not be crossed. Toby Keith was born in 1961 and hails from Oklahoma, a land that has produced many traditionally conservative country stars. He rose to fame in the 1990s, but only really exploded after 9/11 with the song "Courtesy of the Red, White, and Blue, the Angry American." The lyrics asserted, "I'll kick your ass." That's the American way turned Keith into a symbol of tit-for-tat patriotism. While some in the public hailed the song as a wartime anthem, veteran artists, especially Willie Nelson, felt it was a betrayal of musical values. Willie Nelson was a consistent anti-war artist. He sang for Vietnam veterans, spoke out against the war in Iraq, and once said, "Patriotism without compassion is not patriotism, it's just legalized aggression." He told CNN in 2003 when Toby Keith was dominating the charts and performing at a series of military events. That's when Nelson decided to say no. That same year, Nelson was invited to perform at a major music festival in Austin, Texas. But when he learned that Toby Keith was also on the lineup, Nelson quietly withdrew from the show. The organizers did not officially announce the reason, but the Austin Chronicle quoted a member of Nelson's team as saying bluntly, "Willie doesn't want to perform with anyone who is turning war into entertainment." The media was quick to interpret the incident as a dividing line in modern country. Rolling Stone called it a moral divide in country music between those who use the guitar as a political weapon and those who hold the music as a sanctuary of conscience. The audience was divided. Keith's supporters blasted Nelson as old radical. Nelson's fans commented, "If Willie's gone, something's seriously wrong." Toby Keith has not publicly responded, but he has continued to build his brand around his image as a patriotic singer wearing military uniforms on stage, singing at military bases, releasing songs with strong messages. From that image, Keith has built a huge business empire with the I Love This Bar and Grill restaurant chain, his own beer brand, music copyrights, and media investments. As of 2022, Forbes estimates that he owns assets of over $370 million USD, making him one of the richest country singers in the US. Willie Nelson, on the other hand, did not commercialize his image. He did not use his guitar to sell barbecue or t-shirt slogans. But he possessed an asset that no one could put a price on: the absolute respect of artists, the public, and history. He chose to live slowly, write deep music, and maintained a lifelong stance: music is not to promote division, but to heal. Number 2 on the list is a name that makes him equally disgusted. 2. Ted Nugent, the one-man Willie Nelson called too late to save. If Toby Keith was the crack in modern country, Ted Nugent was the real trigger. For Willie Nelson, Nugent wasn't just an artist with a different perspective. He was the embodiment of everything he opposed: extremism and the display of violence as an identity. Ted Nugent, born in 1948, rose to fame in the late 1960s as the lead guitarist of the Amboy Dukes before going solo. Although not a traditional country artist, Nugent often appeared in shows with Americana and Southern rock elements, trying to break into the conservative Southern artist community. But his presence has always been controversial, not because of his music, but because of his statements that are heavily white supremacist, anti-immigrant, anti-LGBTQ+, and openly threatening opposing politicians. Willie Nelson once said succinctly when asked about Nugent backstage at a charity event in 2011, "Some people use guitars to bring light, some people use them to scare people." The remark seemed lighthearted, but to those in the profession, everyone knew Nelson was aiming directly at Nugent. The man who boasted of owning more than 40 guns once called President Obama filthy and declared on stage that he would put the heads of Democrats on a gun rack. Such statements caused many artists, even those in the political right, to withdraw. Willie Nelson did not loudly condemn, he chose to cut ties. In 2014, a Nashville producer suggested hosting a veteran artist fundraiser that would include both Nelson and Nugent. Nelson's response was a one-line, "If Ted's there, I'm not." The organizers then quietly dropped Nugent from the guest list. Willie doesn't work with people who spit fire at the community, a source told Texas Monthly. Conservative media, especially channels like Fox Nation, have come to Nugent's defense, calling him the outspoken voice of true America. Rolling Stone and artists like Jason Isbell and Casey Musgraves have publicly sided with Nelson. A wave of boycotts against Nugent has spread across the independent music scene, especially after he appeared on the campaign trail with Donald Trump and joked about assassinating Hillary Clinton. Nugent's estimated net worth in 2021 was between $10 million and $15 million, largely from touring merchandising and his legacy music. But his influence in the industry has largely lost its artistic value. Nugent is now better known as a professional screamer in far-right media than as an actual artist. Willie Nelson never mentioned Ted Nugent again after 2014, but that silence was doubly powerful. Because in a world where artists often choose to stand in the middle to maintain their market, Nelson remained steadfast in his stand for good. And to him, Ted Nugent was not a dissenter, but someone who crossed the line of reason. The next name that used to be a fan of Willie Nelson has now disappointed him. 3. Kid Rock. From crazy fan to Nelson betrayer with a t-shirt. If Ted Nugent was the man Willie Nelson flatly refused to shake hands with, Kid Rock was his deepest personal disappointment. Because unlike Nugent, with whom he had nothing in common, Kid Rock was once a fan, once calling Nelson a living legend. But then, that same person who once cheered was the one who tore Nelson's image apart with a few political chants, and Nelson did not forget. Kid Rock, whose real name is Robert Ritchie, started out as a brash Detroit rock rapper, but in the early 2000s he began to turn to country rock, and he has been openly idolizing Willie Nelson. In 2003, he performed wearing a shirt with Nelson's face on it, calling him the true soul of American music. But that admiration lasted only until Kid Rock found a new stage: far-right politics. He became one of Trump's most vocal supporters, openly mocking people of color, LGBT people, anti-war activists, and of course progressive artists like Nelson. The breaking point came in 2016 when Kid Rock began releasing t-shirts featuring Nelson crossed out or torn in half alongside the slogan, "Trump 2016 not for hippies." On a Sirius XM talk show, Rock unabashedly declared, "I grew up loving Willie, but now he's a relic of the left that lives on donations and marijuana." Nelson did not retaliate, but he soon refused to perform on CMT Crossroads, where the two were scheduled to perform a duet. The show's production team immediately changed the lineup, removing Nelson's name, but offered no explanation. Variety later quoted a behind-the-scenes source as saying Willie refuses to perform with anyone who would insult him and then sell his image for profit. The media reacted furiously. Rolling Stone wrote a lengthy article headlined, "Kid Rock Shoots His Own Idol," calling it a grotesque betrayal by someone who has never understood the humanities of music. The Guardian described the incident as the moral collapse of an artist who lost himself to appease an angry mob. Billboard commented Willie Nelson doesn't need to answer Kid Rock. His refusal to share the stage with him is the loudest answer. On social media, the #RespectWillie trend spread. Many people shared pictures of Nelson sitting next to his old guitar, in complete contrast to Kid Rock wearing fake armor, holding a gun, screaming on stage. One user, Twitter, wrote Willie inspired both Johnny Cash and Snoop Dogg. Kid Rock only inspires people who shoot beer cans. Of course, the far-right community fought back. Rock support groups circulated memes mocking Nelson as a traitor in a wig and encouraged the use of t-shirts with his face on them to be attacked. But the more they did so, the more Nelson's image was defended by those who wanted to preserve some humanity in American music. Kid Rock, meanwhile, is not in financial trouble. He still has an estimated net worth of more than $150 million, which comes from touring beer and whiskey brands and merchandise linked to anti-woke culture campaigns. But among real artists, his name is almost never on the list of invitations to perform at major prestigious festivals, especially events where Nelson is considered a mascot. Willie Nelson never mentioned Kid Rock again after 2016. But that silence was a judgment, because he was the man Kid Rock worshipped. And when that worship was betrayed in exchange for a few rounds of applause from a raging crowd, Nelson didn't need to get angry. He just walked away, leaving Kid Rock standing alone with a screeching mic in the middle of an empty stage. Number 4 on the list is a singer who will surprise you. 4. Charlie Daniels. From stage teammate to a name Willie Nelson no longer wants to mention. If Kid Rock's betrayal saddened Willie Nelson for Charlie Daniels, the feelings were more complex: regret, disappointment, and ultimately finality. Because Daniels had been allies. They had both opposed the war, both celebrated the working class, both took to the stage as custodians of the traditional country soul. But at some point, Daniels went his separate ways, and Nelson could not follow. Charlie Daniels, born in 1936, is one of America's most famous fiddlers. He wrote for Elvis Presley, played guitar for Bob Dylan, and later became famous with the hit "The Devil Went Down to Georgia." In the 1970s and 1980s, Daniels was considered a moderate voice in Southern rock, anti-war, pro-veteran, and singing about ordinary people. Nelson and Daniels performed together many times at charity events. Daniels even called Nelson the last free spirit in a 1981 interview. But after 9/11, Charlie Daniels changed his stance radically. He became a staunch supporter of the Bush administration, blogging weekly against liberals and calling opponents of the Iraq War traitors to our country. In 2003, Daniels published a shocking letter to Hollywood in which he directly attacked anti-war artists, including his former co-stars. "You can sing country music, but if you side with the enemy of American soldiers, you are no longer American." Though he did not name names, Daniels was clearly referring to artists like Willie Nelson, Chris Christopherson, and Emmylou Harris, who were all openly anti-war. Nelson did not respond verbally, but a few months later he refused to attend the Southern Spirit Festival in Georgia where Daniels was a headliner. When Rolling Stone asked Nelson about his split with Charlie Daniels, he simply said, "He's not the same guy I used to play music with." The media reaction at the time revealed a deep rift within the country scene. The Atlantic observed if Johnny Cash was the heartbeat of country, then the breakup between Daniels and Nelson was the sound of a broken heart. Meanwhile, Fox News hailed Daniels as the keeper of American identity amid a sea of traitors. Far-right channels promoted him as a symbol of patriotic country, completely ignoring his early anti-war period. Charlie Daniels died in 2020, with an estimated fortune of $20 million, largely from touring licensing and television deals. In the last decade of his life, he was remembered not for his fiery violins, but for his strident tweets, conservative manifestos, and strident political stances. Willie Nelson did not speak when Daniels died. He did not send a public condolence, he did not mention his name. And for Nelson, who had lost many friends in his life, that silence was not hate. It was regret for someone who had walked side by side on stage, but had gone down a path that Nelson could not follow, and did not want to look back. The next name on the list also disappointed Willie. 5. Merle Haggard. Two legends stand facing each other from two fronts. Of all the people Willie Nelson no longer wants to talk about, Merle Haggard is the hardest to talk about. Not because of pure hatred, but because they once had a friendship, a brotherhood, and a history. But then came a time when differences in worldview, in the nature of music, and in the way they viewed the poor immigrants and protesters, made it impossible for the two legends to stand on the same stage together. Merle Haggard, born in 1937, is an icon of the Bakersfield sound where country meets rockabilly, dirt, and freedom. Coming from poverty and having been in prison, Merle sang about the American working class with a familiar tone. But from the late 1960s, when he released the hit "Okie from Muskogee," he began to be seen as the voice of conservative America. The song implicitly criticized the hippies, anti-war, drugs, and progressives. Willie Nelson, a liberal icon who fought for civil rights and social justice, had clashed ideologically with Haggard on several occasions, though on the surface they maintained a minimal respect. They performed together, recorded the 1983 album Poncho and Lefty, and shared the stage for nearly 2 decades. But behind the scenes they didn't talk much. Willie smokes pot. Merle writes songs against pot smokers, one veteran artist once joked. The real conflict came to a head in 2005. When Nelson and Neil Young launched the Farm Aid Tour and campaigned against the Iraq War, Haggard refused to participate, stating, "I will not stand on the same stage with those who despise American soldiers." The statement, though unnamed, was interpreted by the press as aimed directly at Willie Nelson and progressive artists like Steve Earle and John Mellencamp. When asked for a response, Nelson simply replied on PBS NewsHour, "I love Merle as a musician, but I don't love his voice anymore." After that, Nelson severed all musical ties with Haggard for nearly 10 years. They stopped performing together, recording together, and appearing at festivals together despite frequent invitations. In a 2011 interview, Nelson said something that would become synonymous with the two: "We grew up in music together, but he moved on and I didn't." The media reaction was strong. Rolling Stone wrote that the separation of Willie Nelson and Merle Haggard was like two mountains withdrawing their shadows from each other. Quiet, but cold. The New Yorker goes further. Merle writes about practical America. Willie sings about ideal America, and sometimes the two songs just don't mesh. However, in 2015, a year before Haggard died, the two released a surprise album together called Django and Jimmy, a belated attempt at reconciliation. But when asked at a press conference if their friendship was back, Nelson simply laughed and said, "We still love each other's music. But we don't agree on a lot of things, that was it." Merle Haggard died in 2016 with an estimated fortune of $40 million. He left behind more than 38 studio albums, hundreds of songs, and a deep cultural legacy in conservative America, where he was revered as the unflinching voice of farmers, soldiers, and small workers. Willie Nelson did not attend the funeral. He sent a wreath with the note, "Thank you for the songs, and for the time we sang together." For Nelson, it was the last thing he could do to close a relationship that music had saved, but could not mend the cracks of trust. Merle Haggard, in Nelson's eyes, was a beautiful memory, but a closed lid, a door that would never open again. Next up is a very familiar name. 6. Hank Williams Jr., the legendary bloodline that Nelson called "too loud to listen to." For Willie Nelson, the political snitches he could quietly avoid. But for Hank Williams Jr., the annoyance came not from the shouting, but from the way he used his legacy to legitimize all manner of hate. That was something Nelson couldn't ignore. Hank Jr., son of the late Hank Williams, inherited both his father's Southern rock vocals and his fiery, headstrong tendencies. He's best known for family tradition, A Country Boy Can Survive, and a slew of Southern-inspired freedom anthems, but he's also been associated with racist, ultra-conservative rhetoric. Willie Nelson performed with Hank Jr. several times in the 80s, but a 2011 statement brought the relationship to a head. In an interview on Fox and Friends, Hank Jr. compared President Obama to Hitler. Specifically, he called the meeting between Obama and Boehner like Hitler meeting Netanyahu. The comment immediately caused a stir. ESPN immediately canceled Hank Jr.'s theme song, "Are You Ready for Some Football?" and a series of events cut his name. But what Willie was interested in was not the comparison, but how Hank Jr. defended it afterward. "I have a right to say what I think. Like my dad used to sing this, America is not for wimps." Willie Nelson, a close friend of Obama's who performed at his inauguration, immediately cut off contact. Since then, Nelson has refused to perform with Hank Jr., even at traditional country events. One special occasion at the Grand Ole Opry in 2013, where both were invited to perform in a tribute to Hank Williams Sr. Nelson, backed out just before the show. The media and public reaction was also quick to divide. Fox News and conservative writers called Hank Jr. a victim of cultural censorship and praised him as a courageous voice in an era of silence. Rolling Stone and artists like Brandi Carlile and Jason Isbell, on the other hand, sided with Nelson, calling his comments toxic and unjustifiable. A silent boycott campaign spread among Nashville's young artists, especially after Hank continued to publicly support Trump and spoke at MAGA rallies with phrases like, "Liberals are the cancer on America." Still, Hank Jr. maintains a loyal fan base in the South. His fortune is estimated at more than $45 million, with revenues coming from touring, copyrights, television, and whiskey branding. Willie Nelson has not addressed Hank Jr. by name since 2011. When asked if there was a chance of reconciliation, Nelson shrugged. "I don't hate him, but I don't hear the music in him anymore." That was how Nelson parted, not with an argument, but with silence. A silence that weighed more than judgment. Because when the music was drowned out by anger and hostility, Willie Nelson simply withdrew and left the other man alone amidst the noise he no longer wanted to listen to. Next is a name that makes Willie go cold. 7. Waylon Jennings, the one Nelson cut off without a goodbye. If Willie Nelson was the son of the outlaw country movement, Waylon Jennings was its brightest orbit. Together they tore down the old Nashville walls, fought the labels, and stood up for the artists. But the light didn't last forever because not all of their fellow soldiers were smart enough not to stick a knife in their backs. Waylon Jennings was born in 1937, grew up in a Texas dust storm, and was introduced to the music scene by Buddy Holly. After a plane crash took Holly away, Jennings became the rebellious spirit of country. He and Willie Nelson became sworn brothers throughout the 70s, releasing the legendary million-selling album Wanted the Outlaws, which put country on the map of popular culture. Jennings once said, "Willie is the only guy who can smoke pot, write poetry, and sign contracts, all at the same time." But it was marijuana, cocaine, hard liquor, and a huge ego that broke the bond between them. In 1984, after their joint album, Take It to the Limit, flopped, Jennings began publicly disparaging Nelson in the press, his management skills, his performance style, even his singing. In his memoir, Waylon: An Autobiography, he wrote, "Willie sings like he's daydreaming. I love him, but he lives in his own world, where everything is cool and no one takes his job seriously." Nelson did not respond. But in an interview with Texas Monthly, when asked about Jennings's words, he simply said, "I don't blame Waylon, but I also don't stay around for someone to hit me twice." The two have not performed together since. Willie Nelson pulled out of every Jennings tribute in the 1990s despite numerous invitations. The only time he mentioned his old friend was during a performance of Mamas Don't Let Your Babies Grow Up to Be Cowboys. Nelson changed the final line from Waylon and me to silence. When asked why, Nelson simply said, "I don't sing with those who write memoirs with other people's blood." The media was brutally dissected and the public was divided. Fox Nation described the estrangement between Nelson and Jennings as the shame of outlaw country and criticized Nelson for being too cold to be human. Meanwhile, many independent artists like Sturgill Simpson and Margot Price quietly removed Jennings from their tribute performances that year, a gesture that spoke for itself. Waylon Jennings died in 2002 with an estimated fortune of $7.10 million after a long battle with diabetes and liver damage from stimulants. His musical legacy still carries weight, especially among the new generation of outlaws like Sturgill Simpson and Cody Jinks. But his image in Willie's eyes will forever be a painful chapter. Willie Nelson did not come to the funeral, did not send flowers, did not speak. Just one night later, he closed his eyes and sang "Good-Hearted Woman" without changing the words, without adding anything but singing it more slowly. When he finished, he whispered into the microphone, "Waylon was my brother, but not all wounds heal." For Nelson, a friendship that changed American music ended in silence, not because of hatred, but because trust once torn apart can never be whole again. And he won't sing with anyone he doesn't trust. Number 8 on the list is the name that Willie wants to forget. 8. Morrissey. The arrogant Englishman that Willie Nelson never bothered to mention. Willie Nelson doesn't hate people for being difficult. He especially hates people who wear arrogance like a badge of honor and then use it to judge a culture they don't understand. And to Nelson, Morrissey is the embodiment of that arrogance. Stephen Patrick Morrissey is an icon of British alternative rock, having been the lead singer of The Smiths, a band that defined a generation of melancholy protest and arrogance. But after leaving the band, Morrissey has become a radical figure, anti-meat, contemptuous of American pop culture, and openly nationalistic. To a British audience, this may have been acceptable. But to Willie Nelson, born on Texas farms, raised on BBQ and Southern tolerance, it was outright contempt. The feud had been simmering for a long time, but it erupted at the Johnny Cash Memorial Concert in 2003. Willie was invited to perform, and Morrissey was also among the international artists who were present. But backstage, Morrissey refused to shake Nelson's hand, complaining that he smelled of barbecue, and sarcastically suggesting that Cash's friends, referring to Nelson, should not be present at such a spiritual ceremony. Although he did not say it publicly, the press at the time recorded many references from Morrissey to a long-haired Texan with a taste for raw meat. Nelson did not retort. He simply withdrew from the scheduled duet. But when asked later, he said something meaningful. "One can live without eating meat, but one should not live by looking down on the world that eats." Morrissey continued to make things worse. At a show in Austin the following year, he told the audience that the music here reeks of sex. Many people walked out. The hashtag #MorrisseyOutOfTexas went viral, and in the Southern music world, Morrissey became an unspoken outcast. The public and media reaction was equally unforgiving. Rolling Stone called Morrissey a man who comes to a funeral to tell his story, and musician Jason Isbell tweeted that Willie smokes weed. Morrissey smokes arrogance. Despite retaining a loyal following in Europe and the indie markets, Morrissey has all but disappeared from the cultural map in the US, where country is not just music, but a way of life. His net worth of over $50 million is still enough to last a lifetime. But in the American South, Morrissey's voice remains a cold aftershock that no one wants to mention. Willie Nelson never mentioned Morrissey by name in any interview. Only once, when someone asked him about the most difficult artists he had ever worked with, did he reply without thinking, "It wasn't a collaboration. It was a short visit, and I locked the door after they left." Mine, sir, Garth Brooks, the Nashville giant who Willie Nelson never called a teammate. If Willie Nelson was the embodiment of freedom in country music, then Garth Brooks, with his clean cowboy shirts, stage pyrotechnics, and billion-dollar empire, was the symbol of something Nelson despised: control manipulation and over-commercialization. The conflict between the two was not as explosive as it was with loud conservatives, but a quiet, if no less cold war. Garth Brooks entered the 1990s like a whirlwind, breaking records, transforming country into a product fit for TV commercial stadiums and the Billboard charts. He brought country music to MTV, sold tens of millions of albums, and toured like a rock star. To his new fans, Brooks was a revolution. But to Willie Nelson, he was a sad end to the outlaw spirit that Nelson and his friends had once bled to defend. In a 1994 interview, when asked about the pop country wave led by Brooks, Nelson didn't shy away. "When music is measured in cowboy hats and LED lights, I'm not sure we're talking about country anymore," he said bluntly. It was the first serious criticism from an icon too big to ignore. Brooks responded with silence, but tensions were palpable among Nashville artists. Nelson was left out of several major CMA's events despite being a founder of Farm Aid. In 1996, when Brooks was asked to headline a national charity show, Nelson backed out at the last minute without explanation, leaving a void filled only by a backstage whisper. "I don't stand next to people who wear cowboy boots and don't have dust on them." In response to these moves, Billboard described it as a clash of two worlds, one of the nostalgic West and the other of reprogrammed Nashville. Meanwhile, Texas Monthly made no secret of its stance. Willie doesn't hate Garth. He just sees him as the product of a dream he never believed in. Still, there's no denying Garth Brooks' power. As of 2025, he's sold more than 160 million albums, is worth an estimated $400 million, and has performed for multiple presidents. He's Nashville at its most polished. But in Willie Nelson's world, where music is sold not by lights, but by truth, Garth Brooks is the one who stands outside the circle of fire. Not for any personal fault, but because he is the perfect representation of what Nelson never bowed to: soullessness packaged in success. Willie once said, "Country isn't about the gold-plated microphone. It's about the calluses on your fingers." And Garth, no matter how many sold-out nights he plays, will never get those calluses. Last on the list was a name that made Willie gradually lose faith. 10. Kanye West, the lost man who Willie Nelson never called an artist. Willie Nelson never raised his voice to teach anyone. But to Kanye West, he once said bluntly, "That's not rebellion, that's chaos." And from that moment on, the relationship between the two completely closed. It all started in 2011 at an MTV charity music event in Los Angeles. Nelson was invited to perform an acoustic set, and Kanye was the guest of honor, accompanied by bodyguards and a media crew. Immediately after Nelson's performance, Kanye, according to an eyewitness from the event, muttered, "We don't need some old guy singing slow cowboys here." The words reached Nelson's ears not long after. He did not react violently, only emphasizing in an interview with Texas Monthly that there were people who entered music not for the art, but for the illusion. Although he did not mention names, everyone knew who he was talking about. Kanye then continued to stir up trouble with his radical political statements, shocking TV appearances, and presidential campaign. In a 2019 interview, when asked about collaborating with American legends like Willie Nelson, Kanye simply replied, "I'm a legend, I don't need them to collaborate to be one." The answer was echoed all over Twitter, where the country music community and Nelson fans responded in unison. The public and media reaction was less than benign. Rolling Stone wrote that Kanye may be a genius, but Willie Nelson is the one thing genius can't buy: authenticity. Meanwhile, Jason Isbell simply wrote, "Chaos doesn't make country." Although Kanye's fortune once topped $1 billion before it was slashed by a contract severance, that's not the yardstick for Nelson. He once said, without referring to anyone, "You can buy a gold microphone, but you can't buy a real song." And among the names Nelson never bothered to mention, Kanye was at the top of that list. Which character do you dislike the most? Comment below.